In this third Ukraine explainer video, I'm going to address questions about sanctions. And I'm not going to give a comprehensive overview of sanctions. It's a massive topic, but I'm going to try to address some specific questions. But before I do that, I want to answer a question that a lot of people have asked me, which is if we wanted to help the people of Ukraine, how could we help them? And in particular, it's sometimes difficult to find, charitable organizations that you know you can trust. So let me give you a couple of names of things that I know to be legitimate. Some that you've heard of are UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, Children's Emergency Fund, Médecins Sans Frontières, which is also known as Doctors Without Borders. They're very active in many war zones, including Ukraine. There's an organization, if you want a Ukraine-specific organization, there's an organization called Razom for Ukraine. That's Razom, which is the Ukrainian word for together. So Razom for Ukraine, which I think you can find on Facebook. A friend of mine in Kiev, who I emailed with yesterday, basically said what we need is weapons. So I think what he would want us to do would be to say, call your members of Congress, and tell them to get as much hardware to Ukraine, weaponry to Ukraine, as soon as possible. Which really leads us to into the question of whether sanctions are going to work. And the short answer is not in time to protect Ukraine from this onslaught. The economic sanctions that are put in place, or even if you think of some more extreme economic sanctions, they will cause economic harm to Russia, though how much is doubtful or questionable. They'll cause harm to the Russian economy, but generally gradually over time. And of course, the last thing the Ukrainians have right now is time, because there are tanks rolling into their country. If a really good set of sanctions package would create a lot of pressure on the Russian economy. Russia gets a huge amount of its revenue, for example, from selling raw materials, natural gas, and oil in particular, but some other things, and some from selling wheat and foodstuffs. But as it turns out, the sanctions that have been put in place on Russian banks so far have had exceptions carved out, so that the Western Europe can still pay for the natural gas they use, so that we can still get oil out of Russia, and still get food out. We do that, of course, because we're trying to minimize the impact on us of the sanctions. But the effect of that is that it makes the sanctions less hurtful to Russia. It's also the case that since 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and eastern Ukraine the first time, that the West put a lot of sanctions in place, and at that time, Putin and Russia sort of began a program of sort of sanctions-proofing their economy, in particular, socking away a lot of money, but also trying to become less reliant on these things. So the sanctions, in the long term, will probably slow growth in the Russian economy. But that's on a scale of 10 to 20 years. And in the short term, it's not going to deter Russia. It's quite clear to me that before he decided to give the go-ahead to this operation, Putin had already, quote-unquote, priced in sanctions, which is he had a pretty good idea of what sanctions might be out there, and he said, yep, I can live with that. So I don't think we should expect sanctions are going to solve the problem. That being said, I still think it's incredibly important to do them, because symbolically it's hugely important to say we absolutely reject this. We're not going to pretend that this is okay. We're not going to pretend that we believe all your propaganda to say you are provoked. This is awful, and we're saying so. It's also important because in the long run, that slower economic growth rate does matter. It matters in terms of the Russia's ability to build up its military in the long term, and in terms of the internal legitimacy. One of the things eventually that undermined the Soviet regime was the fact that its economy was growing so much more slowly than those in the West. So that's sanctions in a nutshell. Related to that actually, let me deal with another direct sanctions question first, which is one of the questions is, since Russia is so dependent, since the West is so dependent, Western Europe is so dependent on Russian natural gas and to some extent oil, can the U.S. or OPEC countries ramp up production and exports to sort of to minimize the impact on Europe of Russian oil and natural gas? And I don't want to dig too far into this, but I want to make an important point, which is that it depends a lot on whether you're talking about oil or natural gas. Oil is very easily put in gigantic super tankers. You've seen pictures, and schlepped all over the world. And so oil essentially it's a single global market, really with a single price that varies only a little bit based on the quality of the oil. And so oil's not such a big problem. Russia controls about 11% of global oil production. And so you take that 11% out, prices are going to go up, but there's really no place that needs oil that can't get it. Gas is very different in that the easiest way to transport gas is through pipelines. And those pipelines, therefore, are not easily, so gas is not easily then moved around the world. And Western Europe depends a lot on gas that comes in pipelines from Russia. Overall, Western Europe gets about 30% of its natural gas from Russia, but in Germany, that's 40%. In places like Bulgaria and Poland, it's closer to 90% or even more than that. So some of the countries in Western Europe would really struggle to run their economies without Russian gas. And because it's brought by pipeline and there aren't alternative pipelines, it's hard to just say, oh, we'll bring it from Texas. There is a technology known as liquefaction in which you take gas and say, for example, in Texas, you compress it till it turns into a liquid. You put it on pressurized containers on ships at very high pressure. And then you would take that to Europe, and then you would depressurize it, turn it from a liquid back into a gas, and go ahead and distribute it. The problem is twofold, really, is that infrastructure takes time to build, and it's very expensive. And over the years, the Europeans have sort of made their choice that they'd rather deal with cheaper gas that comes from Russia and maybe has this problem of supply rather than the more expensive gas that would be liquefied and brought from other places. And I think now they're probably questioning whether that's such a great idea. But at least in the short term, Western Europe needs to get its gas from Russia, which means they want to modulate the sanctions to the point where they don't end up with no gas to run their industries or heat their homes. So I think a lot is being done very quickly to get more and more liquefied natural gas from elsewhere in the world to Europe, but that will take time, and it will take time for Europe to adjust. SWIFT. A lot of people have asked this question about SWIFT. What is SWIFT, and what would it mean for Russia if Russia were suspended from it? SWIFT stands for, I have to remember this correctly, System for World. Anyhow, it's for interstate. The IFT in SWIFT is for interstate financial transfers, and the S is for system. And I'm sorry, I don't remember what the W is for. But it's a system. It's a computerized system that allows banks around the world to send money from accounts in other countries. I've done a couple things where I do, say I give some lecture or something for some outfit in Poland or somewhere else, and they're going to pay me. I have to send them a SWIFT number to my bank here in California along with my account number, and lo and behold, the money shows up in my account. Well, you can imagine if you're running a business, you do hundreds of these transactions a day if you're doing anything that involves imports. So the SWIFT system is one of these things that none of us ever sees, but it's kind of the connecting tissue of the global internationalized economy. So if Russia were cut off from SWIFT, its firms essentially wouldn't be able to buy stuff from abroad or receive money for things that they were selling abroad. So that actually would be a pretty big hit, and it would be pretty immediately felt. The problem is, again, you'd have this problem of, well, then how would we pay the Russians for the gas that the Europeans are buying? And if we weren't paying them for it, would they keep on sending it? So SWIFT so far is something that's been seen as a bigger hammer than we want to use, but it's pretty interesting to see that, for example, Mario Draghi, the prime minister of Italy, came out earlier today and said he was now supporting shutting off Russia from SWIFT. I would have to do some looking, but my sense is that the only sort of really big, powerful country that's still objecting is Germany, and so I think there's going to be more pressure as this conflict goes on, and that would be a much bigger deal. It would cause a lot of harm to a lot of Russian businesses. We'll have to watch that space. Could the U.S., if we get beyond economic sanctions, could we use cyber attacks to hamper this Russian invasion? And I can't say anything definitive about this because the U.S. and other governments keep pretty tight wraps on their cyber warfare capabilities. That's pretty highly classified stuff, and definitely above my pay grade as a college professor to know about. But we can take it for granted that the United States has developed a lot of tools to potentially attack Russia. Whether we actually have the ability to hamper their military systems, I would say in general I'm skeptical about, because I would assume that the Russians have done a pretty good job of isolating their military systems from the wider internet. But I wouldn't be surprised if there were a few tricks the United States could play. My sense is so far, and I've been watching this pretty closely, is because actually people have asked as well, is are we going to see cyber attacks from Russia on the United States as part of this conflict? My sense is that both sides are holding back because neither side really wants to find out what the other side has up their sleeve. And so that's a place that nobody's gone yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point a larger cyber war broke out. Last question maybe I'll ask is, can Russia sanction the West back? And in a way, it can in a couple of ways. The biggest one, of course, is it could stop selling natural gas to Western Europe, which would really harm European industry. And in the long run, of course, it might make it hard to heat European homes this winter or next winter. That's the biggest thing that Russia can do. After 2014, it did some other things that were a lot less important because, frankly, most of us don't consume a lot of goods that come from Russia, nor do most of us buy a lot of things are selling a lot of things to Russia. But there are some places where it's a big deal, and there is some concern in those places. So I'll stop there on this video, and I'll come back and maybe try to do a third one today in which I take a whole bunch of sort of other less connected questions than these. Thanks.